Hey everyone, how's it going? This is Paul from Thinking Christian, and in this quick video what I want to do is give an interesting difference between theism and atheism, and explain kind of why I'm a theist as a result of this difference. Although it wasn't this difference that particularly caused me to accept theism, that's for different reasons. But this is an interesting video, I think, because it brings out an interesting distinction between theism and atheism that's worth talking about. So this is actually based on one of Thomas Nagel's ideas. What I realized is this idea is also present in some of Stephen Meyer's work. I just was first exposed to this argument when reading Mind and Cosmos. And the goal of this video isn't to convince you of theism, but to explain some interesting distinctions between theism and atheism, explore them and talk about some of the issues with each. So there's a real fundamental difference between theism and naturalistic atheism, and we'll talk about it and talk about why this is an interesting thing. The other thing I want to say is there are ways around this that end up not choosing a side. So if you're a pantheist or pantheism in some of its forms, you don't need to worry about this distinction. Also, whatever Nagel's conclusion is in Mind and Cosmos, which isn't naturalism, and it's not really theism either. I don't know what he's really advocating for. It's a great book, though. You should read it. But I think this would be another way out. But really the biggest difference here, if you think about it, is actually the precedence of mind and matter. Which comes first? Under theism, mind actually comes before matter. God is this ultimate mind who then creates matter or nature. So mind comes first, then you have matter that comes as a result. Whereas under atheism, it is matter, i.e. nature, that comes before mind and gives rise to mind or creates mind. Now, this creates some interesting challenges to each of these views. So let's talk about first challenges that this brings to theism. How can a mind exist independently of matter? We're all familiar with minds requiring matter to exist. So what we're doing in theism is we're proposing the existence of a mind that exists without a sort of brain or without a material basis. Now, with that being said, that doesn't necessarily mean that mind is completely reducible to matter. I think that's certainly something that's very difficult to establish. But in the same way, if we think of God as a spirit, God is a sort of disembodied mind to a certain extent. This is an odd thing. This is a different thing than we're, I guess, typically used to. And we could ask, is this a consistent thing? Is this something that makes sense? Now, I think it does make sense, right? I think the idea of mind just possibly existing or not necessarily needing a medium, being its own thing is very different. But, this comes from very Western philosophical tradition of dualism, the idea of mind and body kind of being these separate things, and you could potentially propose a third thing, which could be spirit, potentially. Whether you're a dualist or I don't know what the 3-1 is, or a monist, it just depends. But I understand skepticism, including would be inductive skepticism, which would be saying, okay, every mind we can experience has a physical medium. Of course, once again, whether or not the mind itself is reducible to the physical phenomena, rather it just needs a sort of vessel to operate, that's a different sort of question. But I do understand the sort of skepticism here. The other thing that you would have would be another option you can say is there's teleology, right? Teleology or a will come first and give rise to matter. And as a result, you end up beginning with logical principles like causality, reason, and mathematics. These are more fundamental that govern matter, nature itself. And as a result, truth really exists independently of matter. This is a very strong line of thought in theism, and this is what, the ancient Greeks and the Neoplatonists, and of course all the Christians and Catholics throughout history have thought about. I do think it makes sense, but it's an interesting thing to think about. Now let's talk about challenges to atheism or naturalism. So this is challenges to the other side. How can matter give rise to mind? We're going to ask that particular question. We have Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, and also Darwin's horrid doubt. Basically, does the natural basis of our mind undermine our reasons for trusting it? Does the fact that the mind was created by faculty or by natural selection, because natural selection I think is pretty much, if you're a naturalist, really your only explanation for mind, does this give us a reason for distrusting it? Because it wasn't selected for its ability to track truths, or at least track metaphysical truths. It was just basically designed by a non-truth tracking process. So as a result, under naturalism, our minds were not selected for their ability to grasp truth. They were selected for their ability to survive. And to the extent that survival and truth are related, I think that's a difficult thing. You would need to make that particular argument. And then you get into these arguments that naturalism itself is self-defeating. This would be Plantinga's argument. C.S. Lewis also has a similar argument. The idea of what is a thought? Thought being, if you're a naturalist, an actual electrochemical reaction. What does it mean to actually believe something? Do we have free will? Do we have control over our beliefs about things? And then another thing, under naturalism, what the heck is reason itself? You can ask, what mathematics is, and then you can ask what reason is. Like, why is it that our brains are able to use reason, and why should we trust reason under naturalism? Is it something more fundamental than matter, or is reason something that governs matter in a more fundamental way? And if so, how is that squareable with naturalism? How is it possible that our minds are able to access reason? It's a weird thing. And that's really the big question for naturalists that I think is difficult to answer. I think this is where I think it's very difficult for the naturalist to argue for the existence of reason under naturalism. Now, some naturalists try to say, okay, well, reason is just part of mathematics, but then that just pushes the problem of reason to the problem of mathematics, which I think in and of itself is a challenge to naturalists. From what I understand, a lot of mathematicians are actually mathematical Platonists, so they believe things like perfect circles actually exist and these sorts of things. And that's a weird thing, right? What is it about mathematics that makes it so useful to our minds? These are interesting questions. Is it that reason allows us to come up with truth? If so, how? And if so, why? I mean, these are really fundamental questions about things. Now, I think naturalists can offer an explanation for this, but I think a better option is not being a strict naturalist in the traditional sense, and instead being if you're tied to atheism, being a whatever Thomas Nagel recommends in Mind and Cosmos, where he still allows the potential for moral realism and the opportunity for, of course, reason to exist. He talks about it as the universe basically slowly becoming self-aware, which I thought was actually a pretty profound statement. But I think like the sort of psychophysical reductionism, this really does rule out our ability to believe things, our ability to trust reason itself. And I think as a result, in some ways, yes, it kind of is self-defeating because it's a position that ends up undermining our reasons for believing it in the first place. And as Aquinas argued to the theist, of course, reason in mathematics will seem a little too convenient, which is why I think there are a lot of mathematicians who are theists, a lot more than scientists, which isn't too surprising. Now, here are a few interesting thoughts, a few things to think about. I don't mean to put this issue to rest. It should be surprising that a higher proportion of philosophers, which are like mind thinkers, are atheists, or they lean towards atheism more than scientists, which tend to be matter thinkers. I found this to be really surprising because I would have thought, given this distinction, more philosophers would be theists than scientists, but this is not the case. But perhaps not. Maybe science relies very heavily on mathematics, and as a result, this is not surprising. But then, of course, with the use of reason, that's kind of a strange thing. There's a long history of mathematics, philosophy, and theology being very difficult to separate. I mean, this is literally, it's only been really the last 100 years that these things have all been separable. There have been a lot of really smart people throughout the years that did stuff in mathematics, philosophy, and theology. Even science, too. You kind of have these fields being much, much more related. Only recently did they kind of split up into their academic disciplines. Like Cantor, for instance, when he did his whole set theory, his ideas about infinity, he literally thought this was communicated to him by God. He was very heavily associated with the Lutheran Church, these sorts of things. So I think, his work in theology and mathematics were pretty closely related. So the idea that these are their own individual particular fields of study is actually really a more modern sort of thing. The other thing itself, and this is becoming a new field in philosophy, is philosophy of information. Like, what is information, and does it require a mind? You can thank, Shannon for this information theory, for coming up with the fundamentals of information from a mathematical perspective. But the idea of the information content of things, it's a very new thing in philosophy, and it does seem to have a teleological component. Like, I am trying to communicate a specific message, and I want you to receive this message. There seems to be this teleological component, which you can then argue either for theism or for some sort of teleological atheism, which is what Nagel does. You can consider a computer program in this case, right? I write a computer program to add two numbers together, 2 plus 2. But if you don't know about how I've encoded these numbers, you would never be able to deduce that this computer program was written for a specific purpose by just looking into the computer if you had no context for how this information was presented. So this is kind of an interesting thing. And I think this is actually something that really does weigh heavily in people like Thomas Nagel, Antony Flew. These people, I think they really were a little bit, I think one of the things that at least was shocking to them was this idea of information. So hopefully this becomes a new field in philosophy. The philosophy of information really needs to be done, and I hope there are a lot of people that, really smart people who go into it. I'm very closely related to that as an electrical and computer engineer, so information is very much the heart and soul of what I work on. But I don't know how much Shannon's idea of information theory gets seen outside of electrical and computer engineering, statistics. For whatever reason, it's not taught as much, and I think this is a problem or it's a mistake. So interesting stuff to think about. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you're a theist or an atheist, why, and I don't know, have a healthy conversation. But yeah, have a good one.